Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast, the award-winning counterfactual history podcast that tops the What If charts. Enough of me, though. It's over to the guys.
Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So, we're still number one in the counterfactual charts. Obviously, it's a well-stuffed chart, and not sure who else is in it apart from us. But anyway, number one's number one. And at least we're not number two.
Even more in
Right. Okay, so today the bus is taking hopefully a journey where our listeners will think, "Oh, never thought of that one." There's an interesting what if. So, where are we today then, Ian?
So we thought we'd look at if I'm not sure what the terminology is, but the lease that the United Kingdom had with China for Hong Kong and its territories was, I think we said 100 years in addition to what it was. So it finished in 1997. So what if it had been extended to 2097?
That's right. So 199 years instead of 99 years.
Yeah.
So 1898 was when it was signed. Obviously, the Britain at the time probably didn't worry too much about 99 years. It was it had an empire, was a powerful nation. Probably thought that's what would happen in 100 years' time, and they'd just carry on waltzing through, and things wouldn't change, or didn't care what would happen.
I don't think many humans really care what's happening in 100 years, unfortunately.
No, that's right.
So it wouldn't have been much of a consideration.
So they signed that. So the new territories is what the deal was, because the actual island of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. So it was only when the colony, the Hong Kong, the island, pretty barren, doesn't have much. I don't think it's got any natural water sources, things like that. So as a standalone colony, it was always susceptible to issues associated with food, water, all that type of stuff. So it wasn't really a colony that could be sustainable just as the island. It always needed support. And I think that when the population grew, outstripped the actual island itself, that was when they negotiated this territory, or the new territories for this land, which is on the mainland.
Yeah.
So Ian's sort of looking at a fly, I think, are you? Is it a fly?
It is a fly, isn't it? So anyway, I can speak.
Yeah, well, it just shows you this is a real world podcast. You don't get many people who have flies interfering with the podcast.
Really interfering with that of acting killets, but carry on. I can speak in.
Well, you can speak then while you're swatting it now.
Yeah. Well, no, you carry on. You were doing your preamble. So
the new territories. I better be honest, I can't remember how much.
Well, Kowloon was one.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual amount of land, obviously was more than enough in 1898.
Well, even in 1997, I can't speak for it now, but in 1997, there was vast parts of the Hong Kong territory were unpopulated in the sense of certainly urban sprawl, or countryside. So, obviously that's a rather long time ago in the context of Chinese development, but I think there was plenty of countryside in the British colony of Hong Kong, as well as built up buildings and such like, and airports, or the airport and such like. So yes, it was a mixed territory of farmland, unused land up near the Chinese border, and obviously the Hong Kong that most people are familiar with, the densely packed housing and skyscrapers and all the rest of it, which came in place after from the 1960s.
That's right. So Hong Kong essentially, I suppose it's debatable, but you could argue that Hong Kong was like the center of finance, for example, in Asia. It's had that sort of. It was where a lot of trading was done. I mean, that was why Hong Kong became a thing, a colony in the first place, because it was a good trading location. It had a fantastic harbour. It was good for shipping. It was very deep water and sheltered from typhoons, from what I understand. And if you look at Hong Kong as it gets into the 60s and 70s, it's becoming a very big, successful financial trading sector within that part of the world. I mean, Singapore may be on a par, but there weren't any other cities that you could really point to.
Well, yeah, and also importantly is it was a free tax area in as much as that you weren't, a free port, which is a thing that's come into place in the last 20 years. Many countries have inverted commas free ports where things can come in and go without being subject to taxation to generate revenue, in terms of supporting that process rather than intrinsically taxing it. So that was Hong Kong's certainly unique selling point in the era, the post-war era, the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Not many. Singapore was the same, but not many other places really had that, and no countries had it. But things were made in Hong Kong. I mean, the classic thing, until China came along, was that you used to get toys.
Everything was made in Hong Kong.
Made in Hong Kong, yeah. Whether it was actually made in Hong Kong or just shipped via Hong Kong because of its tax-free status, or it's trade-free.
It was actually made in China. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about made in China necessarily, but yeah. So it's obviously a successful. What's the expression? Low touch isn't quite the right word. Hands free. That isn't quite right either. But nobody was not a command economy. So the economy was allowed to develop with relatively low taxation, no strategic imperatives from the colonial government or the colonial governor, more accurately. So it was allowed to basically get on and do what it liked. Obviously within the context of some basic human rights of employees and all the rest of it, notwithstanding worked very hard and also there was no slavery obviously or indenturedness or anything. So the economy was allowed to run free.
And as I found out
in the context of laws. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. I was going to say, as I found out, and I know I mentioned this to you before, was that Hong Kong as a colony had to be self-funding. It wasn't going to get any money from the UK government. And it didn't have to give the UK government any money either. So whatever money it made, it raised through taxation in the colony, it kept. So in some ways, it was the fact that it was free trading, was probably quite relaxed in a lot of the regulations when it came to trading or banking and that type of stuff, than was normal, say, in the UK. And it gave them the opportunity to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about regulation in Hong Kong in comparison to other countries, but you get the impression that it was fairly low regulated, which allowed for this entrepreneurial or buccaneering sort of spirit. And they did very well. I mean, obviously China was starting to, so if we look at post-war rather than pre-war, I mean, at the end of the day, during the war, Hong Kong was captured by the Japanese. You're our resident World War II expert. I don't know whether, I don't know what happened in Hong Kong. Or that it's not happening what they did with everybody else.
Well, Hong Kong's always been indefensible. You can't defend a port attached to a major landmass. That's just impossible. So it was a battle of about a week. A lot of Canadian troops were taken prisoner. British troops as well were subject to the usual disgraceful attacks and all the rest of it as prisoners of war by the Japanese. But it wasn't even as held as long as Singapore. It was surrendered in a matter of a few days because it isn't defensible. They've nowhere to go and you've got nothing to defend. So
Oh, you mean at the end of the war they gave it up, the Japanese?
Oh, the Japanese. No, well, yes, the Japanese gave it. No, I was.
Oh, sorry, you were talking about the British.
Yeah, but the Japanese obviously did. The Japanese did surrender to the British at the end of the war by virtue of the war being over. So Hong Kong was never attacked.
Yeah, sorry. No, right. It was just when you said Singapore, it was a week. Was it a week? Was it?
No, Singapore was set. Singapore was the end of the Malaya campaign, so that was several months. But Hong Kong was I think the day, we could Google it. It's out there, but I think it was a week after Pearl Harbor, if that. Not good. So it was indefensible then. It was indefensible. It was always indefensible as a British colony, which is an interesting thought. That's not to say there weren't British forces there. So there was usually a battalion of infantry, frequently Gurkhas, because they were relatively close. And they used to train in Borneo, which is relatively close. So not always, but frequently Gurkhas.
Wouldn't you say it had a reasonable naval presence? I mean, I don't know
which era we're talking about.
Well, let's say post-war. So, we didn't talk about pre-war. I mean, pre-war.
Pre-war, there was the China squadron, but that was really because of the trading cantons, for want of a better expression, that the European powers had up towards Shanghai. So there was a number of river gunboats with shallow draft that were able to go up and down the Yangtze.
Protecting trade.
Yeah, but Hong Kong itself, no, it never really. I mean, certainly after the First World War, it never really had a fleet. It may have had a flotilla occasionally of destroyers, but never significant.
Oh, right, okay.
And it never had unlike Singapore, it never had a shore defence with large guns and stuff. It never had any of that.
No. But I was just wondering whether there was an actual Royal Navy
permanent presence in the in the 80s, there was, so that's a good question, there was a couple of, inverted commas, gunboats. So ships smaller than a frigate, arguably called a corvette. So they were always based in, but they were kind of anti-piracy patrol. So they were not really anything to do with the Chinese, protecting the Chinese. Because let's be realistic, Britain couldn't have defended Hong Kong from China if it was 12 miles up the coast from Portsmouth. They certainly couldn't have defended it from the Chinese in any sense post-war. So, but there was anti-piracy patrols, and a couple of specialist ships were built and based there and not used anywhere else. So small ships with a reasonably large gun, more than adequate for anti-piracy, but of no purpose whatsoever in a real shooting war. But that was
but there would be visiting.
Yes, well into the 60s. The Americans
didn't the Queen, the Ark Royal, I'm sure on the TV
may have done. But that,
if the harbour is big enough and deep enough,
a visiting warship is not a visiting warship. Is a defence of anywhere. It's a visiting warship. But having said that, the Americans,
thinking of moving, when we get to the point of the next century, the 21st century, and the potential differences. Anyway.
Well, the Americans were there frequently because the Americans used it as a rest and recreation area for their Vietnam forces. Generally, their soldiers, but their navy. So their navy was pounding Vietnam frequently with aircraft carriers. The aircraft carrier would retire as flight would retire to Hong Kong, which was well outside the area of operation, so it felt like a proper rest and recreation. So there was always major American units there, but they had no responsibility for anything.
No
idea fared with anything Chinese. Who knows? You can trust them as far as you can chuck them. So that was less the case then, perhaps, or.
Well, listen, I mean, when you look at China at that juncture, China wasn't the country that it is today. It was still very rural. It probably had some heavy industry.
Depends what era we're talking about. That's for our listeners.
Well, 60s, 70s, 80s. So,
well, you say that they still had more. They had plenty of nuclear weapons. They had a big army. How good it was is debatable. With it,
Yeah, but their technological capability was fairly. It wasn't up to a European Western level, which is different.
We're talking the military.
No, we're just talking about the country.
Well, their economy. No, you're right. But then,
we're talking about their economy. So
their economies and military. There's an expression which I'm going to misquote, but that mass has an advantage all of its own. So just having lots of steel mills and lots of shipyards, even if they're not very good technologically wise, you're still pumping out lots of ships and locomotives and
absolutely. But what I'm trying to get to is that was the arguably and I don't know whether this is true or not. If you think about what China was known for in terms of exporting stuff, it's different today. Whereas then it was potentially steel, ship, some food. Staples.
Yeah, not sure about ships. That's more like South Korea, but
maybe not ships then. Yeah.
For internal consumption, because it's a huge country. Yes, they were more than adequately able to cater for their relatively unsophisticated economy well into the 1970s. So the question, I suppose, is if Britain didn't negotiate handing it back.
Yeah, they had no reason to. Yeah.
Yeah. What? I mean, I don't know, and perhaps I should have checked, but I'm always quite amazed that the Chinese Communist government from 1940, something 49, 48, whatever it was,
honoured the agreement.
Well, exactly, because the previous, China for several hundred years by that point had been fractured into various areas, of warlords and emperors and all the rest of it. Some of whom had more of a control over China, what we consider China now, than others. Bearing in mind that China had an expansionist policy and gobbled up bits and bobs of places that weren't necessarily China 200 years ago, But so it's amazing how they honoured it. I think they were, they honoured it so they could join the UN, so they could join the World Bank, etc., etc. So you can't go into the World Bank and UN threatening to take over bits of other people's countries. Once you're there, you can do what you like, obviously, but unfortunately.
Yeah, but I suppose. But one of the reasons, I don't know whether this is true, but one of the reasons could be that it was the gateway into China for trade, so they had control over.
Yeah.
It was an easy way of
but that
what's going in and out.
Agreed. But that presupposes that you're a rational thinker. So Ho Chi Minh, a completely different country. Chairman Mao, he was responsible for the death of, you can make any figure up you like, but 50, 60 million people by virtue of trying, with his little red book and cultural revolution and forcing people out of technological jobs to the field.
When did he die? I can't remember when he died.
1976.
All right, so it's fairly late then.
It was something like that. Again, somebody's going, no, it's 1977. But it was either 76 or 77 without Googling it. You don't remember the Gang of Three who tried to take over, or one of whom was his wife? Ring any bells?
It was ringing a bell, but I mean, I was, 15 then? So,
well, I was 30, John. I can still remember it. But
yeah, but I'm not sure I was that interested in...
well, it's not interested either, but just the terminology of the Gang of Three is one of those things that sticks in your mind. But other than one of the...
No, I remember it.
Yeah,
I just don't remember
I couldn't tell you who the other two were, but they didn't. They lasted about 3 days or something. But anyway, so... Yeah, that did, and the death of Mao did usher in the new China that we recognise today, or certainly the start of it. So what?
The Cultural Revolution ended, and then the
well, it kind of petered to a halt by then anyway. But yeah, essentially that was obviously it was gone with.
Yeah, I mean, didn't they start opening up China to more commercial? It was the country, although the government might be communist.
Sure, it's massively open even to do investment. If that's what
no, I'm not talking about investment. I'm talking about like commercial competition internally within China. It wasn't something that Mao was particularly interested in terms of, if you look now at car vendors, there's loads of them, whereas under Mao, they probably wouldn't have.
Yeah, not 100% under Mao, no. And I don't think, I can visualize what you look like, but I can't think of his name. But the Xi Jinping or something, I think he was he was one of the successors to Mao, and he started the process of internal markets. So I don't think they were keen on Western companies coming in and exploiting China.
No.
Say that they don't have shops and stuff in high-profile places, but they certainly, if you want to build a car factory in China, you turn up with the money to do so. You're not going to get any money off the Chinese government, I don't think, or certainly you're not going to get 3/4 of the money like you might do in the UK if some car company turns up. So that's so they're not stopping in internal investment, but it's a question of what you get for your buck.
Yeah. Sorry.
I was going to say what you generally get is cheap labor. You don't necessarily get all the infrastructure that you would get built for you in Western countries who are trying to to persuade you to build a factory, sort of thing.
Well, that's right. So post 97, so we'd have carried on into so China still wasn't the big. I mean, it was increasing in terms of the amount of.
Yeah, it was obvious to anybody who knew what they were talking about. Yeah, it.
Yeah. Well, I think even then, people recognised that China was going to be a major player in the world economy. There's no doubt about that. I don't know whether people assumed it would be as quick as it has been, or whether they did, or whether the areas where China, where everybody goes to China now so that they can make more money, because ultimately that's the reason why China has all of the exports, is because people have used the term globalization, moved jobs out of their local economies to a cheaper, i.e. Chinese, market, so that they can their profit margins go up.
Yeah, or they've chosen to develop new technologies there as well. It's not necessarily just, who was building iPhones before they built them in China? Was anybody building iPhones before they built them in China? I don't know.
I mean, that's an interesting question. So I mean, there were mobile phones. If you think of mobile phones,
yeah, obviously, but I'm talking about
live match for now. But mobile phones, were they being built in China before? I don't know.
I'm sure they were, but the majority of mobile phones, as we would initially built in Finland, for example. I'm using iPhone particularly, or Apple, because they build X% of their phones in China, some in India. I'm not where they build anywhere else. So I don't think they moved.
They got some in Vietnam, haven't they?
Well, possibly. I don't think they closed factories in Shatesville, Texas, and then moved them to China. I just think they built them in China in the first place.
Yeah. So it was an opportunity and I think you haven't mentioned it on the podcast, but you mentioned it to me before. There was about education. So they'd got a population that was educated to the level that these fairly technical, or highly technical jobs in some respects could be undertaken by a Chinese workforce.
Yeah.
If you got 99% rice farmers, it's now, even if they are cheap, they're not going to be building iPhones.
No. So
it's a gradual thing. It's not as if it was overnight, was it?
No, it wasn't overnight. No. And as you said, I think they started on the traditional technologies of steel making, etc., and all the associated bits of metal bashing that goes with it to nuts and bolts, literally. But the question, I suppose, ultimately is, would there have been any advantage to China in letting Hong Kong remain British? I mean, ultimately, there's two, I think there's two arguments about why. So Hong Kong is supposed to be separate from China in many ways. Now that's been undone by the Chinese just ignoring that. But there was a definite sensation of, when he took it over in 97, of not killing the golden goose that lays the gold, or the goose that lays the golden egg. Now, arguably, the Chinese can't think the metaphor going forever, but arguably the Chinese have reared their own golden geese, and in Hong Kong seems less of an import, and also. Like any country, I don't think they're particularly unique in this. They would be, annoyed at best, affronted, insulted by having this little colony.
So there's no doubt that diplomatic tensions would have been growing at the start of the millennium.
Yeah.
So I mean, let's face it, 97 would have meant nothing in terms of the colony itself, because if we're talking about a 199-year lease, they wouldn't be bothered about going, oh, it's 99 years. 97 would have just been another year that Hong Kong was a colony.
Well, you're right, but so the question would be is when interestingly the tensions may have risen earlier.
Oh, rather because there was an end date, so they knew that.
Well, exactly. So exactly. So, but I suspect China would have been, China was otherwise engaged in inverted commas. It had the Cultural Revolution, which knocked out the mid 60s to the early 70s. And a war with Vietnam in the late 1970s. It was 1950s were post-war and post-civil war in China. So had rumblings with Chiang Kai-shek and what is now Taiwan. So it was otherwise engaged, but then come the mid to late 80s, 90s, it's like, yes, it keeps looking at Taiwan.
Then Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping. I was 3/4 right. Come the late 80s, early 90s, whatever's written on a bit of paper, I think, what's this thing over here? What's this? What's this all about? And so the question is that I think it would take it over, no doubt about that, and it could, and it would.
Yeah, I mean.
Would they is the question? I mean, why would?
Yeah, and what would Britain have done?
Well, Britain can't do anything.
Well, I know, but would they just back down and go, okay, in your lads?
As opposed to what?
Well, I don't know. It's obviously there'd be strongly worded letters.
So Britain no doubt would have gone to unite. So I think I was thinking about this, the interesting analogy, which I only kind of heard about a few months ago, Googled a few months ago. So Goa is a part of India which is a holiday destination, so many people know. And people are always slightly amazed that it's all very Christian. Well, it's all very Christian because it's a Portuguese colony. But the interesting thing, when India got independence, whatever the terminology is, Goa wasn't included because it didn't belong to Britain. So Goa was a Portuguese colony well into the 1960s. Used to annoy the Indians. So what did they do? Oh, bollocks to this. They sunk the Portuguese gunboat, sent some tanks into Goa, and within 2 days it was Indian, because patently ridiculous it wasn't. So that, and what did Portugal do about it? Diddly squat.
Let's stop for a word from our sponsors.
G'day cobbers. When you wake up and you start grappling with the gripes, fair dinkum, you've been a drongo and half cooked the chuck. Your brain's fuzzier than a koala's belly and you're whining like a flaming galah. So what's the go? No worries there, mate. Handcrafted at O-Tech No by a semi-retired bushmedic and a bloke named Kev. Finally get a grip of the gripes. Introducing Snake Oil Spumante. This so-called drink is the go-to when your guts are grumbling and your mood's in the dunny. What's in it? You don't want to ask. Well, it's got Arthur, Dexplaform or something. Let's not worry about that now. One gulp, and the gripes vanish like a politician's promise. A pleasant fizz on the way in, and an unpleasant one on the way out. Oh, techno, you've only gone and blum and done it again.
Today's episode is sponsored by O-Techno, helping yesterday, today. O-Techno is a subsidiary of Uncle Schnookums Enterprises, wholly owned and operated by Deforest Co. Global, pioneers in transforming the world's rainforests into your favorite products. All rights reserved. No claims or returns will be honored.
And we're back.
So,
yeah, I mean, it is. There's a slight difference. Doesn't mean to say they wouldn't have done. Well, the fact that Goa's probably got a few 100,000 people, if that, like tens of thousands of people, whereas Hong Kong's got 2 million or 3 million.
Yeah, but how many of them are British? Virtually none.
Yeah, but don't forget there are certain benefits from China. If you live in Hong Kong and you're Hong Kong native, do you want to be under the communist rule?
What are you going to do about it? That's just the
Well,
yeah.
who knows? I mean, are they just going to lie back and do nothing? I don't
Well, they're
know.
lying
I'm
back
just
and doing
saying
nothing.
that.
Well, they're lying back and doing nothing at the moment while all their freedoms are being taken away. So I
No,
can't
but
see.
it's difficult to say, Nick, because don't forget, the 1997 was always an end date. The people in Hong Kong knew that. That would then Britain is already saying, well, we're going to be legal. We're handing it back.
It's possible there might have been riots and protestations, but Great Britain, as such, Great Britain, Northern Ireland,
started shooting people.
and what could Britain do about it?
Well,
12,000
not much, but stuff. I'm just saying that you'd think that something might.
Well, yeah, okay. So let's look at what could. So United Nations. So the problem is ultimately with is nobody, even Western governments, nobody's going to sit down and defend colonialism. Whether it's patently a bad thing. You can't go around taking parts of people's countries and pretending that you're making it better for them, and whilst asset stripping it and say, oh yeah, and we give you railways. Sorry about the trillions of pounds we just took out you. But so nobody in the United Nations is going to agree with you. They might in private saying, oh, it's a bit of a shame. But the Russians in China, and bear in mind, China is a member of the Security Council, so anything in the Security Council would be vetoed. So there'd be absolutely nothing would happen. What could Britain do about it? Nothing. Literally nothing. And the British government, to be fair, always recognised this. The British battalion, British Army battalion, was there to stop illegal immigrants from China, which was a problem in the 80s. So it was a policing activity. Hence, ditto the Navy, and there was never any Air Force there at all, other than transit through to somewhere else or whatever. So it's difficult to see what. So the issue is that Britain could do anything about it. So the 999-year lease would be a problem only as much as, well, when can we get rid of this problem? That's it wouldn't have been 97, as you said, which is true. Focused the mind. I think it would have happened anyway. When possibly earlier, maybe 5-10 years later. Depends how busy the Chinese were. The thing is, I'm not suggesting there isn't an advantage to China of having this. What was at the time, entrepreneurial, money-rich country, canton area, whatever we call it. That doesn't mean to say that everybody there is rich by any stretch of imagination. They're plainly not. And they would suck that knowledge out there, and they would have it as a slightly different place, which they pretended to actually in 97 and spot the difference there. It's probably slightly better than China, but not much. Still get knocks on the door in the middle of the night and put in prison for saying perfectly reasonable things in a perfectly reasonable manner. So that happened now. So I think Britain would have made no attempt whatsoever to defend it. It's indefensible. The Chinese.
I think it depends on how they would do it. I mean, don't forget, there's a lot of big businesses, big British business in Hong Kong, and coming in with guns, would be an economic problem, not just for.
How though? Don't I?
Well, like so, HSBC is a Hong Kong and Shanghai bank. All I'm saying is that there's
Yeah, but they don't seem to have a problem. They don't have a problem with that now. When people are being put in prison for no reason, and HSBC don't care.
No, I know, but don't forget, we're talking about the Chinese coming in and, in a military sense, and taking Ireland over rather than an actual handover where they knew it was.
In a military sense, that just means soldiers and trucks, because nobody's shooting at them. So it's just one day at the bottom of the road, there's a truck with Chinese soldiers in it.
But but you don't know that there wouldn't be some armed resistance.
Well, from whom?
Like I said, there's some Chinese people people who are born in Hong Kong.
Where are they getting these guns from?
Well, there might have been guns in Hong Kong.
Well,
anyway,
there might have been, but I've met a few people from Hong Kong.
We might get people supplying them guns. And, let's face it, it's not as if it's going to be overnight and everybody just sits back and says, oh, well, never mind.
It's possible. The people from Hong Kong they're separate from China, but they didn't consider themselves remotely British.
No, they didn't. They probably consider themselves Chinese, but I think that... there's still a difference in terms of, there's an authoritarian regime and we're in a free society where we can make loads of money, and they're going to come in and suddenly we're not going to be able to make any money, or our jobs are going to go. Who knows? Well, I'm not saying the ordinary working class person's suddenly going to go and get a gun.
No.
That never happens.
I mean, the bottom line is there's plenty of authoritarian regimes take over and people do nothing at all about it. There's a very good example of that, as 3,000 miles to the west of us. But so I think to say that people would rise, it would be a rerun of Stalin.
I don't think it would be as seamless as 97 happened. I don't think it would be that easy. It just happened and everybody just sailed away into the sun.
Well, okay, but there's lots of examples of countries just being, but as long as you don't go mad. So if you don't start bombing the SH-1T out of it, you just roll your trucks with soldiers in it. And in some cases, example, the Germans took over Norway by having bands playing music down the street as the troops walked in. People were very bemused. Why are they playing music? Oh, Germans. So what can I do about it now? It's like, I'm not suggesting they would come marching down playing trumpets, but if you just roll over the border in trucks and there's no shooting and there's no bombing, who knows who they are? How do you know it's not been agreed? You're a Chinese person in Hong Kong who doesn't speak English, certainly doesn't listen to the BBC, doesn't read the English newspapers. How do you know? One soldier looks much like another. Next thing you've got 20,000, Chinese soldiers there, and well, there you go. It's that's an easy. I get there's other alternatives to that, but it wouldn't.
And that's what we want to talk about, as much as other than just saying, well,
Yeah.
the world would be exactly the same as it is now.
Well, it's not exactly the same because that didn't happen, did it? But it wouldn't be in China's interest to bomb and shell and all that nonsense because we'd love to. But the question is, would they? And I think the British government would be quite happy to wash its hands of it, even though there wasn't a legal. I mean, this legal thing as well. I mean, I often think that's a bit odd. There's a world court of war crimes, but there's not a world court really. There's a world court of tariff and economic issues, but we know who's chucked that out the window. And again, China wouldn't have taken any notes of that either. In terms of going to the World Trade Organization saying, no, they're being horrible to.
I mean, at the end of the day, the key new territories were negotiated; they weren't taken over. It wasn't a.
Yeah,
but the British didn't wander into the new territories. It was a negotiation with the government.
Yeah, and what did Britain get? What did Britain get out of it? The word
just got that land.
No, I'm talking about 1997. So Britain negotiated away Hong Kong, which is fine. They had no choice. But what Britain got allegedly was commitments to treat the people for at least 50 years. One country, two systems, as the
although that isn't part. That was. They didn't have to say that, the Chinese. That wasn't part of the lease agreements that after 99 years that...
Well, obviously not, but once the lease was up and the Chinese said, all right, we're having it back then. And then, lo and behold, they got it back. If Britain had said, well, we don't believe in this bit of paper, which they would never do, Steve, but if...
Well, there's nothing they could do about it, though, is there?
No, exactly, because there was literally, how on earth do you hold back 2 million Chinese soldiers?
Now, what I'm saying is that there's no... there's no legal recourse. Let's just look at it from a contractual perspective. There's a contract. We've got the land for this long. After that, it's back to you.
Yeah.
What you do with it the day, the minute after is up to you. There's nothing in there. In some ways, they managed to get something rather than nothing because the Chinese could have come in and said, well, we're not interested in. They didn't have to because he says, look, there's the date. Now get lost.
Yeah. But then that's the thing. If the lease was 199 years, it's just a piece of paper, as we know, like Trump and Stalin and Hitler. Signing pieces of paper is pointless because the next day they could change their mind. The Chinese could have said, "Well, it's a bit of paper."
Oh yeah, but you have this, like the World Bank has ratings, and if
you're right.
The dodgy country because you won't adhere to agreements and all this sort of stuff. Now, it doesn't stop a huge amount, but it does have some impact.
Off anything, frankly. But no, in principle, you're right. This is the thing that's we're lucky, arguably, in the original timeline, there was rational actors in China. And I think most actors in China, or politicians, if that's the term, leaders in China are rational. But you got never underestimate the opportunity of an irrational actor to come in place. We know who that is. So it doesn't matter if it's going to knock my economy back. It doesn't matter if people are going to die. It doesn't matter if my health system fails. I find this really insulting, so I'm going to do something about it. Morons exist everywhere. But luckily enough, in this era, Chinese morons were not in power. They could have been, but they weren't in the original timeline. They could have in our alternative timeline, even if it made no sense economically, legally, because we've got our security, our rating bank to create bonds down-rated, even though that was a concern of theirs. Blah blah blah. We'll get censured in UN, but we'll veto it. So even if they care about that, there's always people prepared just to do it. As we well know, unfortunately, in this era.
Well, that's now. Yeah. I mean,
it's possible. It's possible that there would be something that would be of advantage to China to not do it. No, I'm no. I think as you said, we're no experts on finance and government borrowing and world trade and all the rest of it. So it's possible that, and I think probable, that they would come and say, well, in 199 years, can we have a chat about that? What about 15 years? And is the British government really going to say, well, no, no?
No, I mean that might have been their first approach. Would have been, look, it's that's too long. We've got to come to some agreement.
Yeah.
And I mean, especially when you look at what China's doing, like the South China Sea stuff, where they're putting dirt into the sea to create an island, and then say that's Chinese soil, so therefore everything between the mainland and that bit of dirt is now Chinese local water. Is it certainly would have come to a head. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's projecting into the future for them. I mean, it doesn't give them anything, but it potentially gives them something.
Well, all I'm saying is that that it wouldn't. We both agree that it would never have gone 199 years, even if the original deal would have been 199.
Well, apart from anything else, I don't know how much you did mention that the colony had to be self-sufficient financially. But there must have been some drag on the British economy or the British taxpayer to one degree or another, or just the sheer embarrassment of it. There were potentially an incentive for Britain to get rid of it as well. So there might have been a quite happily mutual behind the
But then
scenes.
it might, like I was saying, when they did do the handover, the government had $40 billion of cash.
Yeah.
Lying around. So I mean, they weren't paupers. I mean, that's a reasonable amount in '97.
It's big.
And that's a big number now, but you'd think that 30 odd years ago.
Well, there must be there must be some minuses in the ledger of running a colony, even one that's massive. It balances out, but there are other things other than money. There's just, even though it's tiny amounts of soldiers.
But it makes you wonder why there are other equivalents that are still there. Gibraltar is one example, and then there's the cities that Spain have got in Morocco.
Was they were granted in perpetuity. The Gibraltar one is the treaty of something or other.
Oh no, I agree. But Hong Kong could have been like that. They could have. It's only the island that was in perpetuity.
Yeah, but it wasn't really. But also,
I don't know about the ones in Morocco then.
You talking about the Spanish ones in Britain, not
the Spanish ones. No, yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Nobody talks about them very often.
Yeah, but the thing about Gibraltar, the only reason Gibraltar's still, inverted commas, British is because they had a referendum and they choose to be. If they'd said, no, we want to be Spanish, we'd have said, goodbye.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. So we'd have adhered to the voice of the people.
But there was not. But the thing about Hong Kong was it never had a government. Yes, it had a governing council where people could, but the governor was.
They were elected.
Yeah, but they were elected, but they didn't wield out.
Yeah, the governor did.
The governor did. And I don't know what I don't know what the voting.
Well, it's probably
criteria was
an election, for like a council.
Well, exactly, but I don't know if everybody could vote. I don't know what whether they care. They probably give a toss. I mean, they don't give a toss in general. China, full stop. Well, if they do, they're very lackadaisical about lack of freedoms. They got freedoms to do economic things, but not criticise the government. And if the government wants to do something, you can't do anything about it, which is obviously not freedom. Well, I guess our logic saying that's true anywhere. But but in theory, you've got a voice. So so it's the golden egg. Would it have been advantageous for China to for whatever advantage? I think the obvious answer is no, because China seems quite happy with Hong Kong. Hong Kong still exists, notwithstanding all these sort of protests that people end up in years and years have done nothing. But it's still a thriving area of China. China would have
about Hong Kong, Greece. I mean, a couple of years ago there was, wasn't there? There was
No, I don't know what's happened with a lot. I think it's like they put everybody who was complaining in jail, and everybody else took note. That's how it works. You don't have to put half a dozen people in jail, and everybody else stays stumm, don't they? Although a lot of people have left to go to Australia, and quite a lot came to the UK, Australia and New Zealand and stuff. Well, Australia mostly. Not just anybody. You had to have a certain amount of capital, and you had to purpose. What are you going to do with that capital when you get to Australia? I'll give it to you. Oh, fair enough. Thank you very much. We're not direct investing in things in such places. Yeah. So I think a natural conclusion would have been drawn. The question is, I don't think China would have invaded, frankly. They would.
No, I think it would have been. I think you're right. I think it would have been a negotiation. China would have been pressing heavily for.
I mean, 10 years earlier, probably not, but maybe 10 years after, mid-2000s.
Yeah.
Luckily for China, before the nutters started appearing in British politics, who essentially want to hold on to ludicrous pieces of ancient colonial islands in the middle of nowhere for whatever purpose, because the nutters, that's particularly one. So the right-wing nutters in the UK would have been up in arms, but that was kind of before if we're postulating it could be the early 2000s, that's before the Farages of the world stuck their horrible heads above the rocks they'd been hiding under. So there wouldn't have been that sort of populist nonsense that appears in the newspapers and stuff here about some islands in the Indian Ocean, which nobody who reads the newspaper could point to within 10,000 miles, I suspect. So there wouldn't be any of that. So I think a sensible British government would have got into conversation with them and said pretty much what happened in the original timeline. Try and get some human rights on the books. Which was a long
not that that was not that was ever.
Well, then what could we? Yeah, there's
nothing you could do. Yeah.
What can you do about it? You're really going to sanction this world's second biggest economy? And
I don't know. Was it the second biggest? It wasn't the second biggest at that time, was it? Yeah, say 2002.
Must be 2000. Third or fourth or whatever. Depends how you measure these things.
Well, Japan would have been second, probably at the turn of the.
Yeah. Okay. All right, but certainly bigger than your own economy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You're really going to sanction them? How? But no, an interesting thought. I think it's interesting that legally these treaties, how is it legally binding with whom is always the question. And if you break your word on these treaties, who's going to come and chastise you or sanction you? Well, literally nobody.
Well, when you're one of the big boys, nobody. It's like if that was Cambodia rather than China, it is probably still be a colony.
Well, it's not. Yeah. Well, yeah, but you're forgetting. Yeah, but you're forgetting about the owners' keenness to get rid of them as well. Britain doesn't want colonies, so.
No, what I'm saying is, they still. If the say it wasn't China and it was a smaller nation, that is still adhere to the 9-year lease. I don't think Britain would ever have.
Well, it depends. If you said to Cambodia, "Do you want to take it over with these circumstances?" Why would Britain say?
Yeah, but if it's a self-sufficient, self-funding part,
Yeah, but it's a colony. We're not into running colonies anymore, are we? So why would we want to do that?
Britain didn't run it; it ran itself.
Yeah, but why did Britain get rid of all its colonies in Africa in the 1950s? Same Britain did because we weren't in that game anymore.
Well, they went independent. I mean, maybe Hong Kong could have gone independent then.
Possibly, like Singapore. Yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is.
We should have thought that earlier, actually, because that.
No, that's right.
That would have been.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Hong Kong is a Singapore,
Yeah, because Singapore could have become part of Malaysia, but it didn't, did it? It became a completely separate country. So I'm not sure what, but that's another podcast. Although.
Yeah, well, we were going off on one, so as we do, when we weren't looking around much. But
yeah, I think the conclusion is that, irrespective of a piece of paper, Britain would see the writing on the wall. There'd be no benefit in keeping a colony, which we're not in that game. Get into an amicable conversation with a sensible bunch of individuals, authoritarian, communist, notwithstanding what they do with their own people, but in terms of how you do business with them, you can, they're not going to wake up one morning and completely change their mind from the day before, like certain countries we can mention. And it would have been amicable with the threat of, well, if you don't like it, we're going to do it anyway, which is always the case.
Yeah.
And it would be much as it is now, but possibly later and possibly earlier, probably later. As you say,
I think later. I think.
97 would have been irrelevant, so it would be 2007, 2003 or whatever. I mean, Britain's always been keen to try and get rid of colonies. The question is you can't just give them away to somebody. And if the individuals themselves, a la some of the islands around the world in the Falklands or rest of it, if they don't want to be independent, well, we're not just going to truck them away like certain countries like Portugal and stuff. But if they are keen to do it, fine, goodbye.
Yeah, no, it's a pity we didn't think about Singapore before. But anyway, we've come to the end of this podcast. So thanks for listening. Hopefully it's got your intellectual juices flowing. And if there's any feedback, any concerns, anybody shouting at the...
Yeah, particularly if we're
saying this is all allowed to talk.
You're from Hong Kong or used to live in Hong Kong, and either as a British expatriate or a Hong Kong, I don't know if citizen is quite the right word, but citizen is quite the right word. What is it? I don't know, but well, there wouldn't be many.
Resident.
A resident of Hong Kong. By all means, tell us what utter nonsense we're talking, or tell us which bit you agree with.
Yeah, if any, as you say, it could be. It's all nonsense. But we like talking.
Very possibly.
Occasionally we do talk nonsense. Occasionally.
Yeah, occasionally, yes, very. Yes.
Right, so thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back again very shortly with another fantastic, award-winning, chart-topping podcast. Thanks for listening. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
And that's it. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. But after listening to us natter on, why not let us know what you think? Find us on Blue Sky by searching for Chats in Time. On Facebook, search ORC Time. And on X, we are ORC_time. Until next time, cheerio!